Chapter 9. Unexpected Downpour. The gentle rain that had begun during their walk from the bookstore transformed into a sudden downpour just 3 blocks from Eleanor's apartment. What had been a pleasant midnight stroll became a breathless dash through increasingly heavy sheets of water, dogs trotting alongside with varying degrees of enthusiasm for this unexpected development. By the time they reached the shelter of Eleanor's apartment building, both humans were thoroughly drenched, clothing plastered to skin, hair streaming rivulets down their faces. They burst through the lobby doors, laughing with the unexpected thrill of being caught in the elements.
So much for a dignified evening stroll.
She pushed wet hair from her face, droplets scattering across the marble floor of the entry.
Apollo seems to have enjoyed himself at least.
The husky stood proudly at Leo's side, his thick coat somehow managing to appear merely damp, while the rest of them dripped small puddles onto the floor.
Huskies are basically designed for weather drama. Peanut, on the other hand.
The dachshund looked thoroughly disgruntled, his usually sleek coat hanging in wet strands that made him appear half his normal size.
He'll sulk for hours, possibly days. His capacity for weather-related grudges is unmatched.
I should probably get him home before hypothermia sets in, for either of us.
Eleanor glanced toward the glass doors where rain continued to lash the sidewalk with increasing ferocity. The thought of Leo walking back to his apartment in this deluge, of ending the evening that had already ventured so far beyond her carefully constructed boundaries, it created an uncomfortable knot in her chest. Before she could second-guess herself, the words tumbled out.
You could come up, to dry off, until the storm passes.
She immediately felt heat rising to her cheeks, the invitation hanging between them with obvious weight beyond its practical surface.
Are you sure? I don't want to impose on your carefully scheduled Monday morning preparation.
Despite the teasing words, his expression held genuine question, offering her the space to retract if the invitation had outpaced her comfort.
I think my schedule can accommodate unexpected precipitation.
In that case, I accept. Though I should warn you that Apollo's wet dog shake has approximately a 6-foot radius of impact.
Noted. We'll implement appropriate containment measures.
The elevator ride to the 6th floor passed in charged silence, both acutely aware of their rain-soaked proximity in the confined space. Water dripped steadily from their clothing, forming small pools on the floor that Peanut-eyed with profound disapproval. At her door, Eleanor fumbled slightly with the keys, hyper-aware of Leo standing close behind her, of the water trickling down her neck from her soaked hair, of the tremor in her fingers that had nothing to do with the chill and everything to do with anticipation. Inside, the apartment was dark, save for the small lamp she always left burning in the entryway. Eleanor switched on additional lights, suddenly conscious of Leo's presence in her private space. It was the first time she'd invited anyone beyond Maggie into her apartment since moving in, her sanctuary from the world carefully maintained and rarely shared.
This is nice, very precise.
Eleanor followed his gaze around her living room, seeing it through outside eyes for the first time. The meticulous organization, the careful color scheme, the absence of anything superfluous or out of place. It was a perfect physical manifestation of how she'd constructed her life.
That's one way of describing it. Maggie prefers borderline pathological.
I was going to say thoughtfully arranged, but I didn't want to seem too forward.
His gentle humor dissipated some of the tension, drawing a smile from Eleanor despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. She moved toward the hallway closet, retrieving 2 plush towels.
Here, you're dripping on my very precise hardwood.
Can't have that. Precision deserves respect.
Their fingers brushed as she handed him the towel, the brief contact electric despite their waterlogged state. Leo began drying his hair, the casual domestic intimacy of the gesture striking Eleanor with unexpected force. This man she barely knew yet felt inexplicably connected to, standing in her carefully guarded private space, performing the simple act of drying rain from his skin. It created a complex flutter of emotion she couldn't easily categorize. The dogs, meanwhile, seemed determined to assert their own comfort with the situation. Apollo had already claimed a spot on her precisely positioned area rug, while Peanut, traitor that he was, had settled beside the husky as if they'd been roommates for years.
They look rather pleased with themselves.
Canine matchmakers, very smug about their success.
The directness of his observation sent a flush of heat through Eleanor's body despite her rain-chilled skin. Their kiss at the bookstore hung between them, acknowledged but not yet fully addressed.
I'm freezing in these wet clothes.
Same. Though I'm not sure what the protocol is here. I don't exactly have a change of clothes handy.
Eleanor swallowed, acutely aware of the precipice they stood upon. The practical solution was obvious, yet voicing it required crossing a threshold she had carefully maintained for so long.
You could take a hot shower to warm up. I have some oversized sweatpants that might work while your clothes dry.
Leo studied her face, reading the invitation beneath the practical suggestion with careful attention.
Are you sure? I don't want to presume anything.
I'm sure.
2 simple words, yet Eleanor felt their weight as she spoke them. Not just permission for a shower, but acknowledgement of the current carrying them both toward something neither had planned, yet both clearly wanted.
Then thank you for the hospitality.
His understated response, laden with meaning beyond its surface, drew another small smile from Eleanor. She gestured toward the hallway.
Bathroom's this way.
As they moved deeper into her apartment, Eleanor felt a curious lightness spreading through her chest. Each step away from the door seemed to carry her further from the careful constraints she'd constructed around her life, toward something less defined, but somehow more vital. Inside the bathroom, all clean lines and precise organization, like the rest of her space, Eleanor reached to turn on the shower, adjusting the temperature with practiced efficiency. Steam began to fill the small room, fogging the mirror and creating a cocoon of warmth against the chill that had settled into their rain-soaked bodies. When she turned back to Leo, he was standing closer than she'd expected, close enough that she could see droplets of rain still clinging to his eyelashes, could feel the warmth of his breath, despite the small distance separating them.
You're shivering.
His voice had dropped to a lower register, concern and something more primal evident in his tone. Eleanor became acutely aware of her sodden clothing clinging to her skin, of the goosebumps rising along her arms despite the steamy air filling the bathroom.
Just cold.
We should fix that.
His hands moved to her face, gently brushing wet strands of hair from her cheeks with a tenderness that made her breath catch. The careful gesture, so modest yet so intimate, broke something loose within her. Eleanor leaned forward, closing the narrow gap between them, her lips finding his with newfound certainty. Unlike their first kiss in the bookstore, tentative, questioning, this one carried immediate heat. Leo's arms encircled her, pulling her rain-chilled body against his warmth despite their soaked clothing. Eleanor's hands found their way to his neck, his hair, anchoring herself against the dizzying sensation of boundaries dissolving with each passing second. The kiss deepened, months of cautious distance giving way to immediate, electric connection. Eleanor felt herself responding with an intensity that might have been shocking if she'd had any capacity for reflection. Instead, there was only sensation, the press of his body against hers, the taste of rain on his lips, the gentle yet insistent exploration of his hands along her back.
You're still freezing.
His words were murmured against her neck, where his lips had trailed from her mouth.
Shower. Before hypothermia ruins a perfectly good moment.
Eleanor laughed softly, the sound turning into a small gasp as his teeth grazed the sensitive spot below her ear.
Practical even now.
One of us has to be.
There was teasing in his tone, but also genuine concern. His hands moved to the hem of her sodden sweater, pausing there in silent question. Eleanor answered by raising her arms, allowing him to draw the heavy, wet fabric over her head. Steam continued to fill the bathroom as clothing was gradually discarded, each layer revealing more of the trust building between them. There was vulnerability in this unveiling, in allowing themselves to be truly seen by another person after months or years of careful self-protection. Yet with each barrier removed, both physical and metaphorical, Eleanor felt not exposure, but liberation. They stepped into the shower together, warm water cascading over chilled skin, creating a world bounded by steam and sensation. Eleanor closed her eyes as Leo's hands, now slick with her shower gel, moved across her shoulders, down her back, tracing paths of discovery and appreciation.
You are
His voice was rough with emotion and desire.
absolutely beautiful.
Eleanor opened her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that would have made her self-conscious in any other context. But here, surrounded by steam and warmth, his appreciation felt like a gift rather than an assessment. She reached for the shampoo, returning the intimate favor of cleansing. Her fingers worked the lather through his hair. The simple act transformed into something profoundly connecting. Leo's eyes drifted closed, a small sound of pleasure escaping him as her nails gently scraped his scalp.
You're not so bad yourself.
The understatement drew a low laugh from Leo, his eyes opening to find hers. The humor quickly transformed into something more heated as his gaze traveled over her wet skin.
High praise from someone who categorizes everything so precisely.
I'm discovering the limitations of my categorization system.
His hands found her waist, drawing her closer beneath the cascading water.
How so?
Some experiences defy classification.
Their bodies aligned, slick skin against skin. The warmth of the water, nothing compared to the heat building between them. Leo's lips found hers again, the kiss deeper, more urgent than before. Eleanor felt herself surrendering to the current that had been drawing them together since that first meeting at the dog park. The recognition of something essential in each other, despite their apparent differences. What followed transcended simple physical connection. In the steam-filled confines of her shower, boundaries dissolved completely. Not just the careful distance Eleanor had maintained from Leo, but the walls she'd built around her own desires, her own capacity for abandonment. Each touch, each whispered encouragement, each shared discovery of what brought pleasure to the other, created a language between them more honest than any they'd spoken before. When the water finally began to cool, they reluctantly separated long enough to step out onto the bath mat. Leo wrapped Eleanor in a towel, the tender gesture containing equal parts care and continued desire.
That was
Definitely not in my schedule.
The quip emerged naturally, surprising a laugh from both of them. Leo pulled her close again, the towel creating minimal barrier between their still heated skin.
I'm extremely grateful for your scheduling flexibility.
As am I.
Their eyes met, humor giving way to something deeper. Recognition of the significance of what had just transpired, of boundaries crossed that couldn't be rebuilt in quite the same way. With gentle deliberation, Eleanor took Leo's hand, leading him from the bathroom toward her bedroom. The dogs had relocated to the living room couch, normally strictly forbidden territory for Peanut. But Eleanor found she couldn't summon even token objection to this breach of household rules. Some perspective shifts were apparently immediate and comprehensive. In her bedroom, the carefully made bed awaited with its precise hospital corners and symmetrically arranged pillows. Leo took in the meticulous space with a small smile.
I'm sensing a theme.
Are you critiquing my decorating choices at this particular moment?
Appreciating them. There's something deeply attractive about a woman who knows exactly how she wants her world arranged.
As he spoke, Leo drew her toward the bed, their towels abandoned along the way. What followed was both tender exploration and passionate discovery, their bodies finding rhythm together as naturally as their minds had connected over legal research hours earlier. Eleanor found herself surprised by her own abandon, by her willingness to reveal not just her body, but her unfiltered responses, her unguarded enjoyment. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself this kind of vulnerability with another person, this surrender of careful control. With Leo, it felt not like weakness, but like strength, the courage to be fully present, fully engaged in an experience without calculating its value or managing its outcome. His obvious appreciation for her body, for her responses, created a feedback loop of increasing pleasure and diminishing self-consciousness. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets no longer precisely arranged, Eleanor's head resting on Leo's chest as his fingers traced lazy patterns along her spine. The rain continued outside her windows, creating a gentle soundtrack to the comfortable silence between them.
Penny for your thoughts?
Inflation, remember? At least $1 now.
She felt, rather than saw his smile, the slight movement of his chest beneath her cheek.
Fair enough. $1 for your thoughts, then.
Eleanor considered the question, sorting through the complex tangle of emotions swirling beneath her current contentment.
I'm thinking that this was unexpected.
Regrets?
No.
The certainty in her voice surprised even herself.
No regrets. Just recalibration.
Of?
Everything, possibly.
His hand continued its gentle exploration of her back, soothing and stimulating in equal measure.
That sounds appropriately dramatic for a midnight revelation.
Post-midnight, technically.
The precision returns. Good to know some things remain constant.
Eleanor smiled against his skin, simultaneously comforted and disoriented by this new intimacy. The ease between them, the natural flow of banter and touch and understanding, it felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, like returning to a place she'd never actually been before.
Stay.
The word emerged without premeditation, surprising her with its directness.
Are you sure? I don't want to disrupt your morning routine.
It's already thoroughly disrupted. Might as well commit to the chaos.
When you put it that way, how could I refuse?
His arms tightened around her, drawing her more securely against him. Eleanor felt herself relaxing into his embrace, sleep approaching despite the lingering awareness of how significantly her carefully structured life had just been altered. Eleanor woke gradually, awareness returning in layers. First, the unusual warmth surrounding her. Then, the weight of an arm draped across her waist. Finally, the memory of the night before crashing into consciousness with vivid clarity. She opened her eyes to find pale morning light filtering through her blinds, illuminating the man sleeping beside her. Leo's features were softened in sleep, his usual alert intelligence replaced by peaceful vulnerability. The intimacy of observing him this way, unguarded, unaware, created a flutter of something both wonderful and terrifying in Eleanor's chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not any of it. Not the collaboration at the bookstore, not the kiss, certainly not the shower and what followed. None of it had been planned, calculated, or evaluated for its potential impact on her carefully structured reconstruction. Yet here she was, lying in bed with a man she'd known for barely a week, whose approach to life represented everything she'd spent years carefully avoiding: spontaneity, uncertainty, emotional risk. And the most disorienting part wasn't that it had happened, but how right it felt, how natural, how uncomplicated. Despite all logical reasons, it should be exactly the opposite. Leo stirred beside her, his arm tightening slightly around her waist before his eyes opened. The immediate warmth that spread across his features when he saw her, no confusion, no recalculation, just genuine pleasure at her presence, sent another complicated wave of emotion through Eleanor's system.
Good morning.
His voice was rough with sleep, intimate in a way that made Eleanor acutely aware of their continued nakedness beneath her now thoroughly disheveled sheets.
Morning.
Time?
The question, so pragmatic amid the emotional complexity swirling through her, almost made Eleanor laugh. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand.
Just after 6.
Early riser even after midnight adventures. Impressive commitment to routine.
He shifted closer, pressing a kiss to her shoulder that sent a renewed current of desire through her, despite the rational part of her brain frantically trying to regain control of the situation.
Some habits are deeply ingrained.
Fortunately for me, more waking hours to enjoy your company.
The easy affection in his tone, the unguarded appreciation, it all contributed to the growing panic beneath Eleanor's outward calm. This wasn't a casual encounter for either of them. That much was increasingly clear. What had happened between them carried weight, significance, potential continuation beyond this moment, and that terrified her.
I should probably get up. Monday morning and all that.
She made a move to extricate herself from his embrace, but Leo's arms tightened slightly, his expression shifting from contentment to gentle question.
Everything okay?
Fine. Just lots to do today.
The excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. Leo studied her face, his perception, one of the qualities that had drawn her to him, now feeling uncomfortably acute.
You're retreating.
I'm not.
She stopped herself, the automatic denial dying on her lips. Leo deserved better than deflection after the intimacy they'd shared.
Maybe a little.
May I ask why?
The gentle inquiry, free from accusation or hurt, somehow made it harder to maintain her emotional distance. Eleanor sat up, drawing the sheet around herself in a belated gesture of self-protection.
This is a lot. Faster than I expected, than I planned for.
I wasn't aware there was a plan.
That's the problem. There wasn't any of this. And now...
She gestured vaguely between them, at the rumpled bed, at the evidence of uncharacteristic spontaneity surrounding them.
Now you're recalculating.
Wouldn't you?
Probably, though perhaps with less intensity.
He sat up beside her, making no move to touch her, but remaining close enough that she could feel his warmth, could remember with vivid clarity the feel of his skin against hers just hours before.
Talk to me, Ellie. What's happening in that precisely organized mind?
The nickname, spoken with such natural affection, nearly undid her.
I'm not good at this. At unstructured connection. At relationships that don't fit into clear categories with defined parameters.
And what category would you put this in, if you had to choose?
That's just it. I don't know, we barely know each other, yet last night was...
She trailed off, unable to properly articulate the intensity, the rightness, the terrifying perfection of their physical and emotional connection.
Complicated?
Simple. Too simple. Like something falling into place that shouldn't actually fit.
Understanding dawned in Leo's expression, a recognition of the fear beneath her words.
And that scares you, the ease of it.
Shouldn't it? We're completely different people with completely different approaches to life. You embrace uncertainty. I organize it into submission. You adapt to chaos. I eliminate it whenever possible. You create spaces for serendipity. I construct systems to prevent the need for it.
And yet here we are, having connected in ways that transcend those differences.
Which logically makes no sense.
There's your problem. You're applying logic to something fundamentally illogical.
Despite her internal tumult, Eleanor found herself smiling slightly at his assessment.
Another fundamental difference between us.
Or complementary perspectives, depending on how you look at it.
He reached for her hand, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers interlaced with hers, the simple connection grounding amid her swirling thoughts.
I'm not asking for definitions or commitments, Eleanor. Just acknowledgement that whatever this is...
He squeezed her hand gently.
It's worth exploring rather than retreating from.
The reasonable request, delivered without pressure or expectation, created a complicated tangle of relief and apprehension in Eleanor's chest. Part of her, the part that had experienced the unguarded connection of the previous night, wanted nothing more than to lean into this unexpected development, to see where it might lead despite its unplanned nature. But another part, the part that had carefully reconstructed her life after each disruption, that valued control and predictability above spontaneous joy, recoiled from the vulnerability such exploration would require.
I need time to process, to think.
I understand.
And she could tell he did, could see in his expression that same perceptiveness that had recognized her professional capabilities, her hidden passion for meaningful work, her struggle between structured safety and meaningful risk. He was giving her space without abandoning the connection, offering patience without pressure. It only made the confusing tangle of her feelings more complex.
For what it's worth, I'm not retreating. When you've had time to process, I'll be at the bookstore, or the dog park, or walking Apollo by the river on Sunday mornings.
The simple statement, weighted with unspoken meaning, hung between them as sunlight continued to strengthen through the blinds. Outside her bedroom, Eleanor could hear the dog stirring, the familiar jingle of Peanut's collar suggesting he'd located his morning toy. Reality was reasserting itself, the magical bubble of their nighttime connection giving way to the practical considerations of Monday morning. Yet even as Eleanor felt herself retreating behind familiar walls of caution and calculation, part of her recognized that those walls had been fundamentally altered by what had transpired between them. Some boundaries, once crossed, could never be perfectly reconstructed. Some experiences change the terrain of one's life in ways that no amount of careful rebuilding could fully erase. As Leo leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead before rising from the bed, Eleanor knew with unsettling certainty that whatever happened next, her carefully plotted path had been permanently, irrevocably altered. And the most terrifying part wasn't the deviation itself, but how little she found herself regretting it. Chapter 10, Recalibration. The sound of her apartment door closing echoed with uncomfortable finality, leaving Eleanor standing in her kitchen, coffee mug clutched in both hands like an anchor in suddenly turbulent waters. The clock on the microwave displayed 7:18, nearly 45 minutes behind her usual Monday morning schedule. Peanut watched her from his cushion near the balcony door, his expression somehow both judgmental and wistful. He'd performed his own small protest when Apollo and Leo departed, retreating to his bed with dramatic flair that suggested profound canine disappointment.
Don't look at me like that. We both need our routine back.
The dachshund responded by turning his back to her, tail flicking once in what could only be interpreted as sass.
Very mature.
She moved through her apartment with deliberate purpose, determined to reclaim the familiar rhythm of her days: shower, dress, make bed. Each action performed with mechanical precision, as if perfect execution of these mundane tasks could erase the disruption of the past 24 hours. But as she smoothed the comforter across her mattress, tucking precise hospital corners that had been thoroughly destroyed the night before, unbidden images flooded her mind. Leo's hands tangled in her sheets, the play of shower-dampened muscles across his abdomen as he moved above her, the unexpected breadth of him pressing her into the mattress. Heat rushed to her face, equal parts embarrassment and rekindled desire. Eleanor straightened with almost military sharpness, as if physical discipline could banish the memories that continued to assault her senses. The scent of her shampoo on his skin, the gentle scrape of stubble against her inner thigh, the surprising weight and fullness of him as they'd joined.
Focus. For heaven's sake, focus.
She marched to her closet, selecting a crisp white blouse and charcoal pencil skirt with the focused intention of a general planning battle strategy. professional attire as armor against the vulnerability still echoing through her system. In the kitchen, she prepared coffee with robotic efficiency, measuring grounds with the precise leveling of a laboratory technician. The rich aroma as it brewed only served to remind her of Leo's Italian roast, of the artful foam designs he'd created on lattes at the bookstore. Eleanor glanced at the calendar hanging on her refrigerator, its neatly scheduled blocks representing the structured approach to job hunting she'd maintained for 29 days. Today should have been day 30, with 3 applications to complete and 2 networking follow-ups scheduled between 9 and noon. Instead, her mind kept drifting to historical property designations, to the documents scattered across Leo's reading table, to the breakthrough discovery about the artist's collective that might save Cornerstone Books and the surrounding businesses.
Applications first. Legal crusades second.
She informed the empty kitchen, as if speaking the words aloud might reinforce their priority in her scattered attention. At her desk, laptop open to a half-completed application for Mercer and Doyle, Eleanor found herself staring at the blinking cursor with uncharacteristic disconnect. The carefully crafted language describing her professional qualifications suddenly read like text from a foreign autobiography, technically accurate but emotionally distant. She minimized the application window, opening instead her notes on the neighborhood historical designation. The familiar structure of legal research provided immediate relief, her mind engaging with the comfortable precision of precedents and procedural requirements. This was familiar territory, regardless of the context, identifying the problem, researching applicable law, developing strategic approaches. Yet even here, memories of the previous day intruded. Leo leaning over her shoulder as she discovered the crucial evidence, his hands on her shoulders in that moment of triumph, the electric current that had passed between them just before their first kiss. Eleanor pushed back from her desk with a frustrated exhale, Peanut raising his head from his nearby cushion to observe this unusual breach of routine.
This is ridiculous. I'm a professional adult who has successfully maintained focus through bar exams, 70-hour work weeks, and literal courtroom battles.
Peanut's head tilt suggested skepticism regarding this self-assessment. She returned to her laptop with renewed determination, forcing herself to complete the Mercer and Doyle application with methodical efficiency. The familiar process of highlighting relevant experiences and crafting persuasive professional narratives gradually settled her scattered thoughts, returning a sense of control to her morning. By 9:45, she had completed the application and moved on to the first networking email, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision. The familiar rhythm of professional communication, polite but confident, memorable without being presumptuous, provided momentary refuge from the emotional turbulence still swirling beneath her composed exterior. A soft knock at her door shattered this hard-won concentration. Eleanor froze, heart accelerating with embarrassing immediacy. Had Leo returned? The possibility sent contradictory waves of anticipation and panic through her system. She wasn't ready, hadn't processed, hadn't decided, hadn't constructed a coherent response to the seismic shift of the previous night.
This is absurd,
she muttered, smoothing her skirt as she rose from her desk.
I am a grown woman, not a teenager with a crush.
Yet her hand hesitated on the doorknob, pulse thrumming with precisely the adolescent nervousness she'd just denied. With deliberate composure, she opened the door. The hallway was empty, save for a brown paper bag sitting neatly centered on her welcome mat. Attached to it was a small white envelope with Eleanor written in now familiar handwriting. A mixture of relief and, absurdly, disappointment washed through her. Eleanor gathered the package, carrying it to her kitchen counter where she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note card bearing a sketch of a coffee cup with steam rising in artistic swirls. Beneath it, Leo had written, "In case you forgot to eat again. The coffee's not as good as fresh made, but it should still outrank anything in your precisely organized kitchen. Take all the time you need. I'll be alphabetizing poetry by color when you're ready to talk." L. The understated humor, the absence of pressure, the recognition of her need for space. It all hit Eleanor with unexpected force. She opened the paper bag to find a carefully packed breakfast, a container of still warm eggs with herbs, crisp bacon wrapped in waxed paper, a small jar of roasted potatoes with rosemary, and a sealed thermos that undoubtedly contained his exceptional coffee. Eleanor stared at the spread, a complicated knot forming in her throat. In her experience, men responded to emotional uncertainty with either aggressive pursuit or cold withdrawal. Leo had somehow found a third option, respectful distance that nonetheless communicated continued presence. She unpacked the breakfast, arranging it on her kitchen counter with uncharacteristic disregard for the crumbs that scattered across the normally pristine surface. The thermos opened with a soft hiss, releasing the rich aroma of Leo's perfectly brewed coffee. Eleanor poured it into her mug, watching the deep amber liquid swirl, remembering the care with which he'd crafted each cup at the bookstore. The first sip confirmed what she already knew, even transported in a thermos. His coffee outclassed anything she could produce in her own kitchen. Eleanor leaned against the counter, allowing herself to truly savor both the flavor and the gesture behind it.
He cooks. He makes exceptional coffee. He respects boundaries while maintaining connection.
She addressed Peanut, who had materialized beside her at the first scent of bacon.
This is highly inconvenient for my attempt to maintain emotional distance.
The dachshund's expression suggested complete agreement with this assessment, though his focus remained firmly on the bacon rather than her emotional dilemma. Eleanor broke off a small piece for him, another deviation from her usual rules, before settling at her small kitchen table with the breakfast and her laptop. As she ate, she found herself opening her browser to the historical preservation application rather than returning to her job search. The food was, predictably, perfect. Simple ingredients prepared with evident skill and attention to detail. Eleanor found herself wondering what other talents Leo possessed beyond bookselling, coffee making, and unexpected culinary proficiency. The question led inevitably to memories of his other demonstrated skills. The confident touch of his hands on her body, the intuitive way he'd read her responses, anticipated her desires. Heat bloomed across her cheeks and spread lower, a physical reminder of sensations still fresh in her memory. Eleanor forced her attention back to the historical designation application, channeling the uncomfortable energy into productive focus. The requirements were straightforward: documented evidence of historical significance, community impact statements, photographic evidence of architectural elements worth preserving, and signatures from at least 30% of property owners within a quarter-mile radius. With a methodical approach, she could have the application completed within days, rather than the weeks such processes typically required. Eleanor created a detailed task list, assigning priorities and deadlines with the efficiency that had made her an asset at Hargrove and Associates. This was familiar territory, problem-solving through structured analysis and strategic planning. Yet, as she worked, a subtle but persistent awareness hovered at the edges of her consciousness, the recognition that her motivation extended beyond professional challenge or even friendship. She wanted to help Leo, not just his legal problem, but him specifically. The bookstore owner with his unconventional organizational system and philosophical approach to mouse infestations. The man who made transcendent coffee and remembered how she took it. The person who saw past her careful professional facade to the conflicted woman beneath. This recognition triggered a cascade of uncomfortable questions. Was she allowing emotional entanglement to influence professional judgment? Was her interest in the historical designation primarily about legal merit or about protecting something, someone, she was coming to care about? And if the latter, what did that imply about her carefully maintained separation between personal and professional spheres? Eleanor pushed back from her laptop, the half-eaten breakfast temporarily forgotten as these questions circled like restless predators.
This isn't helping anyone.
The words landed in her quiet kitchen with unintended weight. Perhaps that was precisely the issue. She'd spent years structuring her life around professional advancement and objective achievement, rather than subjective concepts like helping or connecting. Even her interest in public defense work had been framed in terms of career trajectory and skill development, rather than its human impact. She'd maintained careful distance from the messy reality of actual clients, actual lives affected by legal outcomes. Now those boundaries were dissolving, leaving her without the comfortable structure that had defined her professional identity. The historical designation wasn't just an interesting legal puzzle. It was about protecting Marcus's flower shop and Diane's bakery and Leo's carefully curated bookstore categories. It was about people, communities, things that mattered in ways that couldn't be quantified on a resume or leveraged for partnership consideration. Eleanor glanced at the calendar on her refrigerator with its carefully blocked schedule and meticulously tracked applications. Day 30 of unemployment. Nearly a month of persistent effort to reclaim the exact life she'd lost, to rebuild what had been taken from her with the clinical precision of an architect following unchanged blueprints. But what if the original design had been flawed? What if losing her position at Hargrove wasn't just an inconvenient detour, but an opportunity to reconsider the destination itself? The thought landed with unexpected weight, disturbing the careful narrative Eleanor had constructed around her temporary setback. She'd been so focused on rebuilding what was lost that she hadn't questioned whether it should be rebuilt at all. Her phone chimed with a calendar reminder. 10:30 a.m., follow-up call with Williams and Reed. Eleanor stared at the notification, remembering the 42nd floor interview with its subtle condescension and burnt coffee. The practiced responses she'd delivered, calibrated for maximum impact with minimal revelation of actual personality. She thought of Leo's question from their river walk. I just find it interesting that the work you called important is your backup plan rather than your first choice. At the time, she'd felt defensive, interpreting his observation as judgment of her priorities. Now, with the clarity that sometimes emerges only after significant disruption, Eleanor recognized the simple truth in his words. She had relegated meaningful work to Plan B status while pursuing the safety of corporate practice, not because she preferred it, but because it offered clearer metrics for success, more reliable validation of her professional worth.
Well, that's inconveniently insightful.
Peanut, having given up on additional bacon, tilted his head at this unprompted observation. Eleanor returned to her laptop, opening a new document alongside the historical designation application. Instead of resuming her work, however, she found herself creating a 2-column list: corporate law and public interest law. Under each, she began noting not just practical considerations like salary and hours, but more subjective factors: the nature of the work, the impact on actual human lives, the alignment with her own suppressed values. The exercise was methodical, analytical, her natural approach to problem solving, but the content felt radically different from her usual professional calculations. As the list grew, patterns emerged that couldn't be easily dismissed. Her reasons for pursuing corporate law clustered heavily around external validation, financial security, and paternal approval. The public interest column contained fewer practical advantages, but significantly more entries related to personal meaning, alignment with deeper values, and potential for genuine impact. Eleanor sat back, contemplating this unexpectedly revealing exercise. It wasn't that she disliked corporate law. The intellectual challenge, the strategic thinking, the high-stakes negotiations all engaged her analytical mind. But something essential had been missing, something she'd glimpsed during her brief internship with the public defender's office, and again while working on Leo's historical designation problem. Purpose, meaning, connection to actual human outcomes beyond profit margins and shareholder value. The phone chimed again, a reminder of the Williams and Reed follow-up call scheduled to begin in 5 minutes. Eleanor watched the notification fade from her screen, making no move toward her phone. Instead, she returned to the historical designation application, her focus sharpening with renewed clarity. The Williams and Reed position could wait. This, the preservation of a neighborhood, the protection of small businesses that served actual community needs, felt suddenly, unexpectedly urgent in a way that corporate litigation never had. Eleanor worked with methodical intensity, breaking down the application process into manageable components with assigned priorities. The legal research portion was well underway, but they would need community impact statements, architectural documentation, and property owner signatures, all requiring coordination beyond her individual efforts. She was developing a task allocation spreadsheet when another knock at her door interrupted her focus. Glancing at the time, 11:47 a.m., Eleanor realized she'd been working for over an hour without the usual periodic schedule checks that typically punctuated her day. This time she moved to the door without hesitation, assuming another delivery from Leo. Instead, she opened it to find Maggie, still in scrubs from her overnight ER shift, a bakery bag clutched in one hand, and a suspicious gleam in her eye.
I brought post-shift carbohydrates and expect full details about why you missed our scheduled job search progress check-in call.
Eleanor stepped back to allow her friend entry, mentally calculating how much to reveal about the previous 24 hours. Before she could formulate an appropriately edited version of events, Maggie spotted Leo's breakfast spread still on the kitchen counter, now including the thermos and note propped against it.
Interesting. Very interesting.
It's not what you think.
Based on the half-eaten breakfast clearly not prepared by you, the handwritten note, and your failure to answer scheduled communication, I think it's exactly what I think.
Maggie moved into the kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of a decade's friendship, depositing her bakery bag beside Leo's breakfast remains before turning to study Eleanor with diagnostic precision.
You slept with him.
It wasn't a question. Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks, the physical betrayal confirming Maggie's assessment before she could formulate a verbal response.
Ha, I knew it. The minute you mentioned his coffee-making skills, I knew it was just a matter of time.
This is wildly inappropriate conversation for a Monday morning.
Technically, it's my Friday night, so the inappropriateness is perfectly calibrated.
Maggie settled onto one of the kitchen stools, helping herself to coffee from the thermos.
Holy mother of caffeine, this is good. The man has talents.
Eleanor's blush deepened, unbidden images of Leo's other demonstrated talents flashing through her mind with inconvenient vividness. The defined muscles of his stomach contracting as he moved above her, the unexpected breadth and length of him as they joined, the confident touch of his hands on her most sensitive places.
That's quite a blush, counselor. I'm going to interpret it as confirmation of multiple talents.
Can we please change the subject?
Absolutely not. I've waited through 29 days of job search updates. I'm owed at least 5 minutes of scandalous details.
Eleanor sighed, recognizing the futility of resistance. Maggie's tenacity was legendary, a quality that made her both an excellent physician and an occasionally exhausting friend.
It was unplanned. We got caught in the rain walking back from the bookstore. One thing led to another.
That's the most boring one thing led to another. in the history of sexual encounters. I need actual things that led to actual other things.
We were working together on a legal strategy to prevent his former business partner from demolishing the bookstore's block. I found a crucial historical connection that could qualify the area for protected status. We celebrated. It was late. It started raining.
And
We got very wet walking back here. I invited him up to dry off. We didn't immediately focus on the drying part.
Maggie's delighted laugh echoed through the kitchen.
Eleanor Washington, champion of understatement. Based on that Technicolor blush, I'm guessing the non-drying activities were memorable.
It was, yes, very.
And now you're having a minor existential crisis because it wasn't on your carefully plotted life timeline.
Eleanor stared at her friend, the accurate assessment landing with uncomfortable precision.
How did you... Please. I've known you for a decade. You've color-coded your closet by seasonal appropriateness. Unscheduled emotional connection is basically your nightmare scenario.
The observation, delivered with affectionate exasperation rather than judgment, startled a reluctant laugh from Eleanor.
When you put it that way, it sounds ridiculous.
Because it is ridiculous. Brilliant, competent, occasionally terrifying Eleanor Washington, afraid of a little human connection because it wasn't penciled into her 5-year plan.
It's more complicated than that.
Is it, though? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty simple. You met someone who makes exceptional coffee, treats your neurotic dachshund like royalty, and apparently has skills that trigger autonomic vasodilation.
She gestured to Eleanor's still-present blush.
Most people would consider this a positive development.
Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the city skyline beyond her balcony. From this perspective, she could just make out the district where Cornerstone Books stood amid its eclectic neighbors. The flower shop, the bakery, the cafe with its alliterative scones. A small community of interconnected businesses creating something more valuable than the sum of their individual profit margins.
I can't afford distractions right now. I need to focus on rebuilding my career, on finding a position that...
That what? Replicates exactly the life you had before. The one that left you working 70-hour weeks for people who discarded you the moment their profit margins tightened.
The blunt assessment landed with uncomfortable accuracy, echoing Eleanor's own earlier reflections.
I've been thinking about that, actually. About whether I want to return to corporate law at all.
Now, that is interesting. More interesting than sex in the rain, even.
Not in the rain. After the rain.
Details. Tell me more about this career reconsideration.
Eleanor returned to the kitchen counter, retrieving her laptop to show Maggie the 2-column list she'd created earlier.
I've been applying primarily to corporate positions because they match my experience and offer financial stability. But working on this historical designation project has reminded me why I was initially drawn to law in the first place.
To protect bookstores from capitalist encroachment.
To make a tangible difference in actual people's lives.
Maggie's teasing expression softened, her physician's perceptiveness recognizing the significance of this shift in Eleanor's thinking.
So, the public defender fellowship application wasn't just a backup plan.
It's starting to feel less like Plan B and more like an alternate Route A.
That's quite an evolution for someone who once described uncertainty as inefficiency in action.
I'm still not comfortable with uncertainty, but I'm beginning to recognize that certainty might come at too high a cost if it means sacrificing meaning and connection.
The admission felt both terrifying and liberating, naming the conflict that had been building since her first conversation with Leo at the dog park. The tension between security and meaning, between controlled isolation and messy connection.
And bookstore boy? Where does he fit into this evolving perspective?
That's the most complicated part.
Because you like him.
Because I might more than like him. Which is completely irrational given how briefly we've known each other.
The heart wants what the heart wants, Elle. No matter how inconvenient the timing.
The heart is notoriously poor at strategic planning.
And yet surprisingly good at identifying what actually matters.
Eleanor found herself unable to dispute this observation, uncomfortable as it was. The past 24 hours had clarified something she'd been carefully avoiding, that her careful reconstruction efforts might be focused on rebuilding the wrong things, maintaining structures that had never truly served her deeper needs.
I told him I needed time to process, to think.
And has all this processing and thinking led to any conclusions?
Only that everything is more complicated than it was a week ago.
Or simpler, depending on your perspective.
Eleanor raised an eyebrow, prompting her friend to elaborate.
Before, you had one clear goal. Get back exactly what you lost. Now you're considering what you actually want, what would genuinely fulfill you. That's messier, but ultimately simpler. Authentic usually is.
The distinction resonated with uncomfortable accuracy. Eleanor had been pursuing certainty and stability as proxy measures for success and fulfillment, avoiding the more challenging question of what would actually bring her satisfaction beyond external validation.
When did you get so philosophically insightful?
Night shifts in the ER. Nothing like watching people face mortality to clarify what actually matters in life.
Eleanor turned back to her laptop, where the historical designation application waited alongside her unfinished job applications. The practical reality remained unchanged. She needed employment, financial stability, a professional identity beyond recently downsized corporate attorney. But perhaps the path to those necessities didn't need to be as narrow as she'd assumed. Perhaps there was room for both practical security and meaningful connection, for professional achievement and personal fulfillment.
I need to finish this application. Richard Kincaid's deadline is approaching, and if we want to secure even temporary protection for the neighborhood, the paperwork needs to be filed immediately.
Professional focus returns. But notice the we in that sentence.
Don't overanalyze my pronouns.
Wouldn't dream of it. I'll leave that to you, along with analyzing every other aspect of this situation until it submits to your organizational supremacy.
Despite herself, Eleanor smiled at her friend's teasing. Maggie had always possessed the rare ability to both challenge and support her simultaneously, pushing against her rigidity while respecting the underlying needs it served.
I'm not going to make any impulsive decisions.
Heaven forbid. But maybe consider that not all decisions need to be approached with the same level of analytical rigor. Some benefit from a bit more heart and a bit less spreadsheet.
Eleanor glanced at Leo's note, still propped against the empty thermos on her counter. Take all the time you need. I'll be alphabetizing poetry by color when you're ready to talk. The gentle humor, the absence of pressure, the easy acceptance of her need for processing space, all reflected a way of moving through the world fundamentally different from her own. Yet instead of finding this difference frustrating or threatening, Eleanor felt increasingly drawn to it, as if their contrasting approaches might complement rather than contradict each other.
I need to finish the historical designation research. Once that's submitted, I can consider other complications.
Compartmentalization. Your favorite coping mechanism.
It's served me well so far.
Has it though?
The simple question lingered in the air between them, unanswered, yet undeniably pertinent. Eleanor turned back to her laptop, opening her email to check for responses to her earlier inquiries about expedited historical designation procedures. The practical task provided welcome refuge from the uncomfortable philosophical territory Maggie's question had opened. Yet as she worked, a new awareness hovered at the edges of her consciousness, the recognition that some compartments might be artificial constructs rather than necessary boundaries, that the line between professional focus and personal connection might be more permeable than she'd allowed herself to believe. The historical designation was both a legal challenge and a personal mission. Leo was both a client and something much more complicated. Her career path might accommodate both security and meaning, rather than forcing a binary choice between them. These possibilities unfolded not as conclusions, but as questions, inviting exploration rather than demanding immediate answers. For someone who had built her professional identity around providing definitive solutions, this ambiguity should have been profoundly uncomfortable. Instead, as Eleanor drafted emails to preservation officials and organized research materials, she found herself experiencing an unexpected sense of opening rather than constraint. As if by acknowledging the limitations of her carefully constructed boundaries, she had ironically created more space within them. Space for complexity, for contradiction, for connection that defied easy categorization or strategic assessment. Space, perhaps, for a version of herself she'd never fully allowed to emerge from beneath the weight of external expectations and self-imposed restrictions. Whether she would step fully into that space remained an open question, one that couldn't be resolved through analysis alone, no matter how thorough or precise. This recognition was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, much like the memory of Leo's arms around her in the darkness, offering both freedom and security in the same embrace.
One step at a time.
The familiar mantra, spoken quietly as Maggie rummaged through her kitchen cabinets in search of plates for the bakery offerings, took on new meaning in the context of these evolving perspectives. Perhaps each step didn't need to be plotted in advance. Perhaps the path itself might reveal itself through the walking, rather than requiring complete mapping before the journey began. It was a profoundly uncomfortable thought for someone who had built her entire professional identity around preparation and prediction. Yet, as Eleanor returned to the historical designation application, she found herself wondering if discomfort might sometimes be the price of growth, rather than a warning to retreat to safer territory. Only time would tell whether this newfound openness to uncertainty represented genuine evolution or merely temporary disruption, whether the connection with Leo would develop into something sustainable or remain a brief, intense detour from her carefully plotted course. What Eleanor knew with increasing clarity, however, was that returning to exactly who she had been before Hargrove's workforce optimization no longer seemed either possible or, surprisingly, entirely desirable. Something had shifted. In her perspective, in her priorities, in her willingness to consider paths previously dismissed as too uncertain or too divergent from external expectations. Whether that shift would lead to fulfillment or frustration remained to be seen. For now, there was work to be done, a neighborhood to protect, a legal strategy to implement, a place that mattered to be preserved from those who saw only profit potential rather than community value. And perhaps in the process of protecting Cornerstone Books and its neighboring businesses, Eleanor might discover something equally worthy of preservation within herself. Something authentic and meaningful that had been overshadowed by the structures she'd built to contain it.